from National Geographic. And for me, it was nice to kind of find out how is this working. So I'll just share that with you, because I think maybe some of you might also not know that beforehand. So the world consists of different biomes, and that is like huge regions characterized by its residents, life, environment, and climate. So we are divided into these very big biomes that all of them is Earth and the Earth systems. And every one biome consists of different ecosystems. And an ecosystem refers to interaction between organisms living together in a particular environment. That environment called an ecosystem. And then a habitat that is specific to a species, population of organism. And wherever they live, that will be a habitat. So that's the difference between biomes and ecosystems and habitat. And there are thousands of these systems making all these very important services, meaning that if some things is disappearing, if a habitat is changing, if some kind of species will be more or less in an area, all of these systems will change, because systems are all the time changing. And that's why biodiversity seems to be important. So according to EU, the loss of biodiversity is a problem for the climate, because it's speeding up global warming. It's a problem for industry and agriculture, because these businesses are being highly dependent on natural capital. It's a problem for the security and safety, because among other things, crisis will speed up conflicts and make us more vulnerable. It's a problem for food security, because the making of food is fully dependent on plants, animals, and soil organisms. It's a problem for health, because it's just healthy for human beings to relate to nature. But we have also learned with the pandemic that resilience to diseases is actually connected to biodiversity, because if some small microorganisms are looking for a place to stay, it could be the human body if we are kind of minimizing all other places to live. And it's also a problem for equity, because these crises will hurt the poorest. And when we use more than we have, of course, we will also be robbing future generations for the possibility to live a good life. So this is why biodiversity is a problem according to EU. And I'm also quite inspired by this article showing different future scenarios. So historically, looking decades back, we have been using more and still are than we have, meaning that we are going in that black and gray direction, which everyone can see is not really nice. And if we just increase our efforts to preserve what we already have and take better care of what we already have, things will be a bit better. And that is looking at living organisms and landscapes, which is a part of living organisms. But we really need to increase our conservation efforts and do more sustainable production and more sustainable consumption related to living organisms. So this is relating to how do we manage our rural areas, how do we produce food, what kind of food are we eating, and how much food are we throwing out. So these are very important parameters if we want to work with biodiversity and bend that curve. And seen from a Danish perspective, we have the Danish Red List. It's a list of Danish plant, animal, and fungal species that have been assessed to be at risk of extinction. And recently in 2019, numbers showed that more species was in decline and that the threatened species was being more threatened since the last count in 2010. So we can actually see that now more than 40% of the species in Denmark is being threatened in some way or the other. So we are actually facing a problem here in Denmark concerning our biodiversity. So when I look into the more critical, or you could say develop-oriented literature on, for example, circularity, the thinkers are saying that to think that you can be neutral, this is not enough to bend that line, and to think of doing no harm, this is actually not enough if you want to come within a regenerative approach. And to use resources, products, again, longer or less, it's really, really important, but it is still not enough to bend that curve. And the focus on smarter product use and manufacturing is also really important, but it's still not enough if we want to include the regenerative approach in our way to work with sustainability. Because we need to maintain capital and circularize flows at all scales. This is actually part of the circular paradigm, but we really need to focus on that sentence at all scales, because that's a very, very important sentence. Because as I have hopefully tried to show you, everything is actually connected to these living systems of animals and plants and fungi living in habitats, living in ecosystems, living in these biomes. And these are the scales that you think of when you think with a regenerative approach. And when we look at where we are right now, it's a very, very good idea to increase this capital, this stock of natural capital, because that's actually the capital that's our basis of whatever we want to raise of other kinds of capital. And recently, Kent Webster said, now you can't regenerate steel. You can't regenerate technical material. Regenerative means taking those things which relate to the biosphere and also to the community, because you can regenerate social capital. You can improve the quality of life to make it a more thriving economy as far as how people experience it. So regenerative by design is hinting at rebuilding natural capitals, soils, forests, fisheries, whatever, and rebuilding communities. So this is what the regenerative approach is about, and it's most of all to widen up the scale so we can relate what we do to living systems, because whatever we do is related to these living systems. So to land on some definitions, the regenerative approach here is understood as enabling positive contributions to living organisms and ecosystems. And biodiversity does mean a variety of species, genes, and ecosystems, and it's also called the web of life. So when I say the word nature, you will probably think of all of you of a different thing, because nature can be understood in 1,000 ways. But actually biodiversity has a pretty clear definition. So this is a definition of biodiversity. And now I have been talking about the rural landscapes and about the large scale and ecosystems, and why is it actually relevant here at Bloxhub, and why is it relevant at an urban scale? I would like to elaborate a little bit about that. So looking at Denmark, if we look at how we use land in Denmark, actually 60% is agricultural, and only 10% is like buildings and street and urban areas. So shouldn't we just see, we don't care about these 10%, what can they do in this country if we are looking at this issue in a Danish context? Well, Imagine being a bird here. Imagine being a butterfly here. There is no food for you. There is no courage. It's a quote from an article in New York Times. And I brought it here because what we do in the city and how we behave and develop and live our life is so much affecting how this functions out there, outside the city. And therefore, there is actually no border between rural and urban. We are all the time affecting so much what the farmers are doing out here. This is not to be grown for these few houses placed in the background. This is looking like this because it is going to be transported into the city. So if we again take the Danish perspective, to use Denmark as an example, if we look at how the share of protected land and waters are in Denmark, we are quite fine with waters. We are okay with that. But if we're looking at land where we human beings tend to be most of the time, we are actually seen in a European perspective, the country with the lowest share of protected land, meaning land with a nature of high quality. So we are kind of sitting in the back of the bus in a European perspective, looking at biodiversity on land. And then when you ask people, have you ever heard of biodiversity? And if you say yes, could you please explain it to me? Actually, at a European scale, recent number shows that around 40% of Europeans can perform on this question, against only 30% of Danes. And then if you look at this generation, which I think hopefully will behave and learn more about what we have done than what my generation has been doing, then in Denmark, only around 20% can actually explain what biodiversity is and know it, against 40% in the EU. So I think actually it makes sense to work with this in a Danish context, because if we cannot go out there on the countryside to experience what is a rich nature full of biodiversity, and if we don't know it by knowledge either, and if biodiversity is that important, then we have a good potential to develop. Another reason why it makes sense to work with biodiversity and nature in an urban environment is this study. It's a large-scale mappiness study. You could also have called it a happiness study, because you have been asking people to download an app, and more than 20,000 participants in the UK did that. And then at some random time, that app said a bing, and they were asked, how do you feel? Happy or relaxed or awake, and where are you? And more than 1 million responses showed that happiness is greater in natural environment. And that is not dependent on if it's Saturday or Friday or morning or afternoon or holiday or in a busy week. This is like across everything. And coastal locations are by some distance the happiest. But what is really interesting is that people are least happy in urban environments. So no matter if you are like on a really boring field of stones or on the top of some hill and it's raining and windy, in general, you'll be more happy there than you'll be in the city. So that could also be an answer to why I work with the rich nature in cities. It's actually also for the well-being of human beings. But what can cities actually do for other species than humans? There's no doubt that what really is needed is that we change the huge landscapes outside what we used to call cities. But actually, cities can play an important role for some kinds of species. When you read in the Danish red list made from the University of Aarhus, they are mentioning several very specific and unique habitats for animals, plants, and fungi only being in urban places. And here's a project that has tried to visualize many different habitats for species in the cities. So, for example, if you look at these tall, very tall buildings we have in the cities, I think, well, maybe they look a little bit like some kind of Norwegian nature, the rocks and the mountains. And when I look at the countryside, we have nothing similar out there. So species that like this kind of habitat, they can actually live in the city. And we have a lot of these kind of significant habitats that are attracting certain kinds of species in the city. So we shouldn't overlook the potential and also now existence of habitats in urban areas for different kinds of species. So why biodiversity in species? To wrap up this section, well, it's important for the urban climate. It's good for food security, mental and physical health. It gives us perspectives on industry and agriculture. There's a term called eco-literacy, referring to our ability to understand nature and ecosystems. And I have become to think of cities as the world's biggest platform for learning, where we could get hand-on experience and learnings about ecosystems and biodiversity. Because as the UN said in a report last year, transforming humankind's relationship with nature is the key to a sustainable future. So they're saying, if you don't really know what to take care of, and if you're not loving it, so why and how should you be able to take care of it? And as I talked about earlier, there is also something related to security and safety. The theories are actually a little discussing this, because if you put a certain kind of nature in cities, you can actually create a more unsafe environment, a dark forest in the middle of the city. You could have more crime in there. But there's a lot of other research showing that if you use nature in strategic ways in cities, you are actually really strengthening the security and safety in the city. And everyone should have access to this rich nature because it's good for us. And if we get better at having the right perspectives on industry and agriculture with this full scale of living systems thinking, then we would also perform better in relation to future generations. So some of the theories, ideas that I'm inspired of is this. It's actually, you could call it a design theory called biophilic design. And the idea of biophilia is that biophilia is the inherent human inclination to affiliate with nature that even in the modern world continues to be critical to people's physical and mental health and well-being. So biophilia is like a key term if you're interested in what nature can do for people, also in cities. And Sari is saying ecosystems remain the best known example of sustainable organization of life on this planet. It is logical, therefore, to try to understand and, if possible, to mimic how organisms and ecosystems work and what they do in the creative of a regenerative human habitat. And in her research, she's pinpointing that it is very important for us to do a shift from a focus on how they do this. So a focus on how are they exchanging in a circle. We should instead focus on what they do, that they are actually giving positive impacts on many different and complex systems across each other. So mimicking ecosystem can offer insights into how the built environment could function more like a complex living system rather than a set of unrelated object-like building, and thus become better able to adjust to change. So the city as a forest, as they are imagining in London. And ecosystems and biogeological processes are in constant change. So regeneration, therefore, is a process of engagement rather than a set of outcomes. And this process of engagement has significant environmental, economic, social, and cultural benefits. And that's another term of resonance, which is relevant as well here, where you are more focused on observing what is actually happening right now than on tracking and documenting, because actually the world is in constant change. So where can we get some inspiration to do more of this regenerative approach? Well, I found that it's not easy, and it's not like we have 10 cities in the world that's just a huge success. So one area where I think I could find inspiration is actually art, or the creative area where architects speculate and play together with artists, for example. And I went to Italy with a team of urban planners, and I will show you a few visualizations from this Biennale, which is the largest event in the world for architects and others working with urban development. And I think I'll just share with you one of my colleagues, being an urban planner, actually having a lot to say about urban planning in Copenhagen. When we went there, she said, going around these installations, I suddenly realized that the roof is a lot higher than I thought, that we can actually do a lot more and imagining a lot more than I thought. So I think that's also what art and speculative ways of thinking and visualization can do for us. It can kind of stimulate our imagination. So this was an installation asking, how does architecture recognize, represent, and help us live with other beings? And this was like a huge kind of building that you could go into. There was this BioBot, a collective experiment in biotechnological architecture, where there was a cultivation of the urban microbean. And this is this thing called, I think it's called spirulina, which is like really, really healthy. And they were they could actually like shape buildings of this. And that would be really healthy also for microorganisms to eat. So could we design eatable buildings that could, I think they were also inspired by the pandemic and thinking, how can we make buildings where these microorganisms will move into instead of in our bodies? And then from UK, they have this refugee for resurgence. A multi-species community gathers in the ruins of modernity to find new ways of living. So all at this dining table, you could see traces of different kinds of animals that has kind of met up to discuss how to clean up after these human beings and what to do in a new world. So this was one chair. Yeah. And the last one, I think, is called Borderland, a celebration of plants, their migrations, hybridity, and resistance. Plants have ideas and follow rules. So they were kind of staging that when we think of plants, we think of something green out there. But they are actually having rules and ideas, and they are very, very good at finding new ways of overcoming challenges. So that was trying to give us another view of plants. So could we think of the city as a multi-species habitat? Normally, when we think of habitats for species other than human beings, we are thinking of forests and wetland and grassland. But I would like to share with you an example from Amsterdam, where actually I went with this wonderful Blocktop team being represented today. And it inspired me to look more into what is Amsterdam doing in their work with biodiversity. And they are one of the European cities being a front runner within this field, and they have been working with biodiversity in the urban environment for decades. And among other things, they have made this little publication where they have formulated 20 ideas for integrating biodiversity in urban planning and development. And it is based on, I think, a few decades of working with this in Amsterdam. And they are seeing the city as an interconnected ecological structure, working in many different levels with different kinds of habitats for different kinds of species, but also thinking in how is this connected to each other. So, for example, they are working with integrating nests for birds and bats in buildings. And this is actually something that might be coming with a new EU taxonomy, if you know this. So this is an example of how to do it. They are working with biodiversity in the perspective of many different goals: health and social well-being, climate adaptation, and the nature. And they have a range of principles for their city that is exactly targeting this field. I will not go deeper into it because I think it would be nice to have some discussions as well. So to kind of come to an end, I think it's really important to realize that not only are biodiversity providing us with essential services that we need for all that we do, but it's actually also very healthy for us in very many ways to relate to nature, why it is great to have more rich nature in cities. And there are this area of biophilic design, and these biophilic design qualities, they are experienced through a variety of human senses, including sight, sound, touch, smell, taste, and movement. So it is design principles targeting the human experience of nature. Another way that you could relate humans to nature is to use this BioBlitz method, for example, using an app called iNaturalist, where you get citizens to help you document what kind of species are in this area. And there's a wonderful guide on National Geographic on how to do it. And because there's so much to know, there's so much we don't know, and we could start maybe to investigate more what is actually living around us. Biodiversity needs a lot of time and a lot of space. And we are, as modern human beings, we like very much to fix things. When we see a problem, we want to fix it. And recently I talked with an urban planner, and she said, well, we made this new wetland and we put in a lot of plants, and now we're waiting for these endangered species to move in, but nothing happens. And we think, couldn't we do more, and shouldn't we plant more? And I was like, okay, but when did you kind of establish this area? Well, we did it 2 years ago. And it is so hard for us to wait on that biodiversity. And I just wanted to show you a graphic showing how New York has worked with biodiversity on that high line that is well known. And this is like a scale from 1 to 5 years, just showing that from establishing something until you have a rich nature of plants and animals, at least 5 years will go, even though this is like an area of a very high focus where people are professionals and trying to stimulate that these animals will move in. But that's a special thing about animals. You cannot control them, so you need to wait and see what will come. One of the final slides is another way of working with biodiversity is cities. In cities is this Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity. It's one of the international standards or tools to work with this field. And among other things, they are showing how you can work with a green infrastructure in different ways, both like natural assets, but also how you can implement biodiverse habitats and ecosystem services in other ways than the natural. And here's like, it could be a little bit like the DGNB system, but just totally focusing on biodiversity. So that was a final slide. I hope you have some questions, but also I'd love to hear if you have any ideas of how to stimulate this regenerative approach in your own area. So, but you can ask or comment on anything. Yes.
Thank you, Lotte. Thank you. That was amazing. So I have a good few questions, but I think it's much more fun to open the floor to comments, questions, reflections. That can sometimes be very daunting, but we're amongst friends. Time and space. We can't predict what will then occur if we want to ensure biodiversity. And then you said we want to fix things.
Yes.
And one of the things that is really being interested in designing the ways in which we can do things, the methods. In the biophilia, you said we need to go from the how to the what. So observing or being able to document the what do we then do with the what?
Well, it's because we should maybe be more interested in what the ecosystems do, because they are doing positive impacts on complex areas. So it's not enough to think how do they do it, like they circulate something, because if you don't get the effect of the positive impact, will not really move towards a better future.
And one of the things that also comes across from your presentation is the aspect of the regenerative is giving back. And we have certainly had a few decades where we're quite good at not giving back. So in that transition and in observing what goes on around us, the time and space, based on what you have researched so far and your observations, you've also done, you've talked to a lot of people. What do you see we need to improve in order to ensure us time?
What we need to improve? Well, we need for sure to improve the way we produce food and the way we manage food and what we eat, for one thing, if we talk about biodiversity, and then we need to take better care of the land. But these two are connected, because if we just take all that land and make it go nature, and we don't get smarter about the food culture, then we won't have enough food for all. So these two things are connected. And then why not just focus on the rural landscape? But if 70% of us is living in cities, we need to start where the power is and the people is, also for making a better life for us. But actually, yes, it is also extremely and most important to change the way we use land and produce and consume food.
And earlier today, when we had the pleasure of having a lecture from Professor Daniel Oh from Korea University, where he compared Copenhagen to Seoul, and that was quite staggering, because when we get all the surrounding the metropolitan area, and there is a population of 26 million. So food production certainly becomes quite relevant when it's at such a scale. And what he was reminding of us of was the fact that more and more people are actually seeking to the cities.
Yeah, and when I've been reading this and read about food security, I thought that was an issue like pretty distant from our lives. And now when things are getting really expensive, and there are also poor people in Denmark, I think that issue is getting more relevant for us. Recently, I read about a couple, just like a random Danish couple living in Jutland, in a normal parcelhus. I don't know what's it called in English, a classic house with a little garden. And they had been trying to grow some food, and then over the decades, they had been quite good at it. So now, in that very normal size of a garden, they could produce 600 grams of vegetables and fruit for the 2 person each. I mean, 1.2 kilo per day, all year around. And I think they must be really happy now if they don't have so much money. And I just started to think how much food can an individual actually grow also in the city, because the countryside is now made so big machines can drive between where we seed plants, meaning that it's not very productive per square meter, and actually a normal garden in a little belonging to a little house, a little private urban farming, is producing a lot more food per square meter. I mean, so much more food per square meter than the professional farmers can do. Also because we've used so much pollution that it's quite hard to make an effective food production. So, yeah.
That's one take on it, that we actually start making sure that we can produce our own produce.
Yes.
We actually have a question from our digital audience, Freya.
Yes, Magdalena, thanks for the insightful presentation, and ask that if looking at the time restraint formulated in the recent IPCC report, will the regenerative approach be able to help us reach the ambitious goals we have set for ourselves as the humankind?
That's a tough question, Lotte.
Well, in this study where you show there was the graphic curve that I think it keeps on being in my mind, they are writing that if we actually do change our behavior, taking more care of land and change our food production and consumption and a lot of other things, among others, of course, also to circulate products and to try to integrate circularity in many, many fields. Of course, that's important as well. Then they believe that we can do it. But the question is, how fast can we do it? And how fast will people start to prioritize in ways that make us change? And I really think that as long as we are so detached from nature, as long as we don't even know really what the term means, and we're not experiencing it, I actually don't think we can make the change, because it will change our lives in certain ways. We cannot keep on doing all the things we used to do in the same way.
Some of you are nodding. Do you comments, questions? Do you agree with that is actually a prerequisite for making sure that we reach the goals, objectives? Yeah. Do we need the
My name is Anders. I'm actually a farmer of profession. I teach at the Regenerative Agricultural School of Denmark. I'm just curious to hear what cases you have of the decision making towards new political scheme, like you're highlighting Amsterdam. The Copenhagen City Council was adopting the donut economy, but they let it go again. I'm very much aware of the strong the state of the agriculture in Denmark, but I'm just curious to see, or if you are aware of cases and policies and how people are adapting and fastly adapting new policies.
Well, I have been looking into what the taxonomy is saying about biodiversity, and it seems to be in some ways rather ambitious, at least in a Danish context, because we are lagging behind. But I can also see, that article from New York Times with the very poor soil, not where you were not happy if you were a butterfly. This article actually shows 2 pictures of Italy. One picture is visualizing the Italian regions and how polluted they are in different ratings. Some are more polluted than others. And the other picture is showing the same regions and then how much they are get it funded by, the agriculture is funded by the EU. And the colors are the same. So the more funded by EU, the harder, the worse the pollution. So I really like the biodiversity strategy of EU, and I've heard that the people finding these results actually went to the Commission doing the biodiversity strategy, asking them, but see, when you fund the agricultural business, we have these consequences. But that was like maybe 2 different departments, or I don't know, too much lobbyism. It's just like nothing happened. So we still have all that financing doing the opposite of the policy making within the strategy of biodiversity. And now in Copenhagen, I'm following, we are developing the first strategy ever in Copenhagen that should come into place in like half a year, targeting biodiversity. And I'm following that. But as the area is new for us all in Denmark, or not for us all, but for a lot of us, then it's not easy.
So there was not a quick fix there.
I'm very much aware.
And I think part of it, it's also a discussion that we've had in other situations, that the role of government and the role of policy making is more and more important and crucial. We have part of the network, we have a Grand Solution kind of large-scale research project, and they have been interviewed where they're saying that we can only do so much. Like, we can have individual ideas, we can have if there's not a policy implementation process or development and then implementation following these needs and trends, it's not going to happen. And earlier this week, I had the pleasure of listening to Inger Andersen, who's the director of the UNEP. And she basically said that, as we know, within the built environment, we have a lot of startups and companies that are really pushing bio-based solutions, be it materials for the construction industry, enhancing biomimicry designs, etc. And her take was that some of these startups and companies can only take it so far because the capital that you need in order to drive that to scalable solutions will always be more risk-willing if there are policies supporting that strategy, that vision. So I think just to follow up on your question, that the role of government, the role of policy making is extremely critical in transitioning to this. And the pace varies from country to country, I think. Yeah. Questions? Yeah, thank you.
What do you think would be the best or the next, maybe the easiest next step for the cities to become more sustainable or more aware of the biodiversity?
Well, I showed some of the tools like the Singapore City Index for Biodiversity and the learnings we could make from Amsterdam. They have for sure probably made both success and failures. So I think for a start to prioritize the area at all and then learn from some of the material that's out there, because it's not that we don't know what we could do. We should actually just start doing it. And of course, both from the political level, but also from the bottom up, engaging cities or citizens in trying to implement more both direct biodiversity, but also more awareness of what we need to say to our politicians that they need to do. Yeah, but there's no quick fix.
And at the same time, a sense of urgency. Because we had, not gonna just, but to quote Nicholas from the Circular Built Environment Network, saying there's also a contextual difference that we need to have in place. So, for example, when we've talked about with other companies and Danish policymakers in terms of if we were to kind of ensure the dissemination of one thing that has worked in Denmark, it is the recycling system of empty bottles. And that was actually mentioned as an example earlier today, that is quite unique to have that kind of recycling. Hasn't got anything to do necessarily how to ensure biodiversity, but it certainly has to do with how not to harm the green areas that we do have in cities. My point being that we do have systems in place that can be step by step or piecemeally implemented. The other thing that I know from the city architect of Copenhagen was that we have had an amazing bout of rainfall over the last decade, a little bit more than that. And to try and address bio-based solutions in terms of prevent flooding, we actually have more green areas emerging in Copenhagen. And we were actually not ranking quite well on the list of green areas as accessibility to citizens in Copenhagen. So sometimes it can be other aspects that trigger the transition.
Yeah, well, I think if I should answer you again, I would say one thing we should start to always think of is, are we making a positive impact on more than humans? And that's just so essential, because to reuse bottles is of course important, but it's like we should think of what does that action do for others, not only mimicking activities, but thinking in the positive impact on more than humans. I think that's a key thing.
We are coming to an end of today's Science Talks. Lotte, it has been a real pleasure to have you with us today. And for everyone who joined us virtually, thank you so much for participating. For all of the people with me physically that endured the really rapid decrease of quality in air, thank you for being with us. We will be back for our next Science Talks on the 12th of May, where we are looking at companies trying to create sustainable solutions. So now we're changing the scope a little bit, but we're presenting research that can document these companies' experiences in how to ensure sustainable solutions to cities. So we'll be back in only 2 weeks, and thank you for being with us. Thank you.